Welcome back. Today we're going to start looking at social movements, and the questions we're going to ask are, under what conditions do citizens mobilize against the state? What are some of the variables that strengthen social movement organizations? What can hinder their impact? How can individuals threaten the stability of a non-democratic state? And how might their effectiveness vary based on regime type? Those are more discussion questions that I'll probably pose rather than things I'm going to lecture about. We'll start with the definition of social movements. We can define social movements. A social movement is a, quote, purposive and collective attempt of a number of people to change individuals or societal institutions and structures. So there's the sort of standard pat definition. Social movements are essentially a broader representation of civil society. You often have many civil society groups that come together in the name of a common goal in these social movements. So they're an agglomeration of these various civil society organizations. Social movements can be based on all these organizations, and that's the easiest way to create a movement, because you've got these pre-existing bonds, these pre-existing ties between people, things that already hold these little groups of people together that you can then bring together in a larger structure. But social movements can also, I guess, much less commonly, but they can also form purely spontaneously. Citizens suddenly gather together around some common cause. And we'll talk a little bit about thresholds a little bit later in this class. What spurs citizens into this sort of movement? Even then, though, a pre-existing organization will often take the reins of this loose group of semi-affiliated citizens. These are the organizers who keep the movement going, these pre-existing organizations often. Otherwise, there's a risk that the movement will simply fizzle and fade away. So keep in mind that civil society organizations tend to be relatively homogeneous when we talk about individual civil society organizations, like the chess club, the soccer club, all that sort of thing. For example, individuals come together in the name of some common cause, like supporting marginalized groups or advocacy for more or less social spending in a specific area. Right? We want more spending on, environmental measures or something. Relatively homogeneous groups of people. They also often come together to engage in a common interest, right? Like I just mentioned, swimming, chess, book reading, knitting, all those sorts of things. These are people who have a common interest, and they tend to be from roughly similar socioeconomic backgrounds, similar neighborhoods, etc. Once we move beyond civil society organizations to social movements, we're talking about much larger and, importantly, much more heterogeneous groups. And groups that rely more on conspicuous, contentious action than they did before, right? The old civil society organizations didn't care about making their presence known in society. They didn't care about necessarily pressuring for broad-based change. They would press, if they were politically oriented, they would press for much more narrow changes. Social movements are much different because they're much more based on this contentious political activity. And by contentious actions, what we mean is protests, demonstrations, showing people power. So one question is whether these organizations, these social movement organizations, are going to be effective given their heterogeneity. Which brings us to the question, are organizations more likely to be effective where they're heterogeneous or homogeneous? And so we'll start by talking about homogeneous organizations on the right side here. And again, these are the knitting clubs, the book reading clubs, the pro-gay lesbian activists, ethnic community, pro-human rights, whatever it is, they tend to be relatively homogeneous groups. In other words, people self-select. People enter these groups because they have a common, very defined cause, and they tend to all be from a somewhat similar background. And the advantage of this, well, there are several advantages. One is that they have this common tangible goal that brings them all together. So when we talk about social movements, there may be a general common goal, but underneath that, there can be lots of divisions. There are lots of sort of sub-goals. So for example, we'll get into that a little bit later, so as not to confuse things. But because there are lots of these smaller organizations that represent their own individual goals, they might all come together under the umbrella goal of something else, but they each have their own agendas. So homogenous small organizations have this common goal. And often this is a tangible goal. When we talk about civil society organizations, we're also talking about sort of what you classically think of as lobbying groups. And often they're interested in something very concrete, something that delivers material benefits in many cases, or some sort of other benefits that are much more tangible. And I always like to refer to getting the streets cleaned up, right? Taking the snow removal. That's also something tangible. It's not material per se, but it's very tangible. So, homogenous small organizations have this. Civil society organizations are often also based on pre-existing bonds, right? You join an organization because your neighbor is in that organization. That's how you hear about it. Your brother, your good friend joined, and then they told you about it. So you've got these pre-existing bonds that existed before. Okay? And this helps to strengthen the organization. Because if you leave the organization, well, you're leaving your friends and your family, etc. Now, this homogeneity can also be a disadvantage. Again, if people are from the same community, perhaps the same socioeconomic status, perhaps with generally the same viewpoints, then this can lead to a couple things. They might lack the resources for action compared to a more heterogeneous organization. So, for example, if we're all from roughly the same socioeconomic class, maybe we're going to be limited in terms of the funding that we can put into this. If it's a bunch of farmers, well, the hours that we can put into this. We're all working very hard, and you don't have to be farmers to work very hard. We can work very hard in the city too. Without certain people who have more resources, that could be an issue. And then we've got the collective action problem, which we'll get to in a couple minutes. But so resource constraints. You also have the collective action repertoire, which tends to be more constrained. The ideas for action, in other words, in a homogeneous group, because people are all used to doing more or less the same thing in our homogeneous group, right? I mean, we don't have other models that we look at. So if we're used to writing letters to Congress, then we keep writing letters to Congress. We tend to be more constrained in that. Now, on the other hand, social movements, as these heterogeneous organizations, these organizations of organizations, tend to be oriented around a common intangible goal, like democracy, equality, death penalty, abortion. And when I mentioned gay and lesbian and human rights issues, those are actually bad examples because those tend to be more on the social movement vortex because they're much more about these intangible goals. So going back to civil society organizations, they tend to be much more tangible things like business groups and from the business groups all the way to the chess teams, but they're much more oriented when they get politically involved for concrete things. They want concrete goals to be accomplished. Here we're talking about these more amorphous, again, democracy, equality, those sorts of things that can energize their members. And the key advantage of heterogeneous organizations is that with their different component individuals and groups of individuals, they have different ways of extracting resources and patterns for action. Okay, so this is the resource availability. So people come from different walks of life. They've got different resources. Some people may have more time. Some people may have more money. Some people may have more, kids that can show up, and I don't know. But the point is that they're heterogeneous, so they've got different resources and that they can apply to the cause. They also have different patterns of action, right? Each organization that's a subcomponent of the social movement organization brings its own patterns of action. So some may be oriented towards the letter writing campaigns to Congress. Some may be more oriented towards citizen action, maybe knocking on doors and getting people involved in voter drives. Maybe some people are more oriented towards street demonstrations. Maybe some people are better organized, better capable of striking. You've got all these different organizations that come in and then each bring something to this. And this is a great advantage of these heterogeneous organizations. Now, there are also problems though. This is tough because you've got different levels of need of the collective good. So what we're talking about is in the pro-democracy movements, democracy is the collective good. Well, there are different people who have different levels of need. Go back to the collective action problem. Actually, we'll talk about the collective action problem in detail in a second, because I've probably mentioned it several times without explaining it. But the point here is that people have different levels of need. So, for example, some people are going to benefit more from democracy than other people. People who are farmers out in the countryside probably don't really feel the oppressive state as much as people who are living in the cities, for example. Or people who are who want to be political activists would benefit much more from democracy than the average shop owner who has no interest in political activism. And there are also different levels of commitment. And these things give rise to collective action problems in the free rider dilemma, which we'll talk about right now. The collective action problem occurs where everyone would benefit from a particular good, but no one wants to shoulder the excessive cost of providing that good for his or herself. Right? We all want this good, but none of us want to, and I mean, the fact is none of us probably can provide for this just single-handedly. So let's illustrate this with a hypothetical island community composed of 3 basic groups. Each, to make things simple, comprises 1/3 of the population. We've got fishermen, 1/3 of the population, work-from-home computer programmers, 1/3 of the population, and retirees, 1/3 of the population. Now let's say that all 3 of these groups need to get off their island to the mainland. Right? They all live on this island, but they need to get to the mainland for different reasons. The fishermen need to get to the mainland every day to sell their goods. The computer programmers, well, the island's a little bit boring. Beautiful but boring. They like to go into town to hit the bars every week. And the retirees, well, they're pretty settled. They like boring. And they like to see their grandchildren every month or so, though. At least on holidays. Right? So they've got cute grandkids they want to see on occasion. Now, unfortunately, the rising costs of diesel forced the old ferry service out of business. And in fact, it was a state-backed ferry, and the state said, we're going to cut spending. What's a great way to cut spending? Well, we're not going to offer this ferry service to this island anymore. What these guys really need now, that they don't have a ferry service, is a bridge. A big, expensive bridge. And the bridge is what we call the collective good. And you can see in the background, here's our little island, and there's the bridge going off to the mainland. We want to build this bridge. So this is the collective good. Everyone needs it, and they come together to make it happen, in theory. And it sounds easy at first. Let's each put in an equal share of the cost and get that thing up. 1/3 of the funding will come from the fishermen, 1/3 from the computer programmers, 1/3 from the retirees. Okay? Now here's where heterogeneity creates problems. But wait, say the retirees. You fishermen and you programmers go to the mainland all the time. We only go every month. I'll put on a retiree voice. We only go every month. Why should we have to pay the same amount to build this bridge that you need so much more than we do? Then the programmers chime in. Yeah, agree the programmers. Fishermen should pay the majority of the cost. Now the fishermen, they don't like this. And they respond, oh, wait a second. We're out working from sun up to sundown every day to make ends meet. You programmers sit in your comfy little homes by the beach and earn a lot of money. You should pay the biggest part of the bill. Wait a second, say the programmers. The retirees don't even work. They get money for free from the government. There won't even be any Social Security left by the time we're old. The retirees should pay more than we should. So here, what we've run into is a collective action problem. Everyone wants the bridge, but no one wants to pay for more than their fair share of it. Now, fair share, that's very subjective. It's very relative. You've seen a couple divisions here. The central one is usage. Who's going to use the bridge more? But then income also came up. And you can imagine more sources of diversity coming into the picture. Using the bridge for business versus pleasure, for example. But just wait. Now the retirees are furious. And they respond, you know what? We don't even need the dumb bridge. We're not putting in a penny. You'll build it anyway. We know you need it. Now we've come to what's known as the free rider dilemma, where one actor or set of actors has the ability to provide a collective good, giving other potential beneficiaries an incentive to not pay for it and still hope to benefit from it. The retirees are saying, hey, we know that you're going to build this bridge anyway, and we're just going to use it once you build it. If it looks like people with sufficient resources need the collective good so badly that they're going to provide it anyway, certain groups might just wait it out. Let them build the bridge on their own dime, then we'll use it. Right? And this gives birth to the free rider dilemma. This causes all sorts of collective action problems, but it also creates, it also highlights the problems of heterogeneity again. So the conclusion here is that if this was a homogeneous community, where, for instance, it was just fishermen or just computer programmers, or everybody used the same used the bridge the same way every day and had roughly similar incomes, then everyone would have a roughly equal utilization of the bridge. Each individual would be more likely to bear their fair share of the cost. Okay, so that's an advantage of small homogeneous organizations demonstrated. But there are other advantages of small homogeneous organizations that go beyond this. Feelings of solidarity. And more importantly, social pressures to conform and participate. And it's very easy to spot and discipline those free riders if you have a small homogeneous organization. And this is partly about information. In small communities, absences are clear. People talk. Why hasn't Jen been showing up to meetings? It's also about mechanisms. No one wants to be ostracized from their community, and that is precisely the price you pay for not playing the game. In homogeneous organizations, it's very easy to see who's participating and who's not participating. And it's very easy to punish them, right, by ostracizing them. No one wants to be shut out. In heterogeneous organizations like social movements, it's hard to maintain constant activity. It's hard to make sure that everybody is paying their fair share because you've got different definitions of what's fair, but more importantly, it's very difficult to monitor because it's such a large organization and very difficult to enforce. Right? People can hide in the shadows, and this creates collective action problems for social movements. So now let's bring this back to the social movement context. People are fighting for better environmental standards, an end to the death penalty, or yes, in this case, democracy. All of these things are collective goods. They're also very grand in scale, making them difficult to reach through small, isolated organizations. One small organization or a couple small organizations aren't going to press for democracy effectively. And in fact, what you have around the world are lots of small organizations that try to do this independently, and they tend to fail. But they can be very important in terms of a broader social movement context once things sort of congeal, and we'll talk about that later with the color revolutions. But going back to our issue here, so we've got these collective goods, grand collective goods that are hard to reach through your little organization. And this leaves us with larger social movements with one common goal, but also various competing interests on other levels. So one way you might be able to rectify the collective action problem is to federate. To break that large social movement organization into these sort of natural pieces, into smaller, more homogeneous pieces. These pieces then come together on occasion, or maybe frequently, to engage in collective action. Okay? But on the day-to-day basis, they're very small. You're mimicking small homogeneous organizations, but they're part of something much bigger. As you bring these various groups together, you need to convince people. Oh, right. So what we're talking about is federating the organization, right? Making it into these component federal parts. So what you've got is a heterogeneous organization composed and emphasizing the small homogeneous organizations within it. Everybody is bound by a common goal, but they're also bound to their own peers, their own social networks, their own smaller goals that exist within these more homogeneous units. Okay, and they're much more manageable units. We can tell at that point who's participating, who's putting in resources, whether time or money or whatever it is, whether it's their fair share, right? Because the homogeneous units are more based on everybody with a roughly equal share or interest, because that's the nature of homogeneous units. Okay. So breaking a large social movement organization into these federal pieces can help. as you bring these various groups together for the collective action, you need to convince people that they have a strong interest in the good. Democracy, you have a strong interest in it. Remember, we talked about how there are different people who have different interests in democracy, and of course anything else. You also need to help them go through the process of what we call social appropriation. This is a process whereby existing and generally apolitical groups, the chess group, the knitting group, churches, economic self-help organizations. This is a process whereby those groups redefine themselves as vehicles of collective action. Because that's not what they are in general. That's not what they're oriented towards. Now they need to become engines of collective action. Remember, most social movements and revolutions develop within established social groups, so on the backs of these pre-existing organizations. And this is one of the reasons Western democratizers spend so much on building civil society. Excuse me, even non-political civil society in non-democratic states. Again, the chess club, the soccer club, the artisan groups. These organizations can later be instrumental in facilitating regime change because they pick up these agendas and they help to build these social movements. Once a social movement rises, this mobilization also creates new organizational networks that overlay and interact with these pre-existing informal networks. So you had these small homogenous groups that come together in this large social movement, and this creates new organizational networks as people come together in new ways. In other words, mobilization doesn't just depend on social ties, as I've emphasized, but it also creates new social ties, which can be important. Various members of a protest organization may have joined because of pre-existing social ties to an activist, right? Well, I'm going out to protest because my buddy Brian's out there protesting and my girlfriend was planning on going too, and so the hell, I don't want to be like the lame guy who doesn't show up, right? But all these things also form new social relationships. You form these new social relationships while participating in these collective protests. You meet other people, you hear new ideas, right? You begin to bond with the broader community. So, you have these people coming together, these new relations forming, and all of this strengthens the organization. It strengthens the social movement and reduces the likelihood of free riders. Another important difference between the social movements we're discussing now and the bridge example from earlier is that social movements are purposive. They're materialistic. They're about intangibles versus the tangibles. They're working towards a common but intangible goal, which may alleviate some of the problems discussed before. Think about it. In social movements, unlike with other interest organizations, there are certain benefits actually associated with participation. And this is something that can be exploited. There are big carrots here. Social movements are fun. They give you a feeling of empowerment. They create this sort of euphoric feeling. We can do anything as a group. This solidarity, right? That brings people together. So the carrots are you've got this new collective identity, a change in your own purpose in life, the excitement, the fun of demonstrations. And there are also, as I mentioned before, the sticks. If you don't participate, there's this fear of rejection, ostracism, for defecting from the cause. And this is particularly true, all these things are particularly true, when the social movement is up against a formidable enemy, like a non-democratic state. Because state repression only highlights these group boundaries, those who are with us and those who are against us. And that reinforces group solidarity and creates there have been a lot of studies in the sociological literature about the emotional bonds that are created in these social movement networks that you don't find in other homogenous, small, material, tangible-oriented organizations. Right? We're fighting for a common cause. Still, you can see how, say, for example, banned political party leaders would have a much greater interest and stake in democratization than, for example, retirees. But even on an emotional level, there's evidence that people at the core are the most committed, the most invested. And so now we're still talking about differentiation, heterogeneity that can actually hurt the social movement. But this also means this means that the largest group of participants in a movement that's only temporary, really, because social movements are only temporary, this largest group of participants are only superficially engaged. So they're only somewhat emotionally involved in this, meaning they've got much less invested in the organization and are more likely to bail on it if things get rough. They turn into free riders. In particular, if the regime cracks down, this may prompt some to turn into free riders. Go back to your apartment block and watch out the window as things transpire. So all these are big problems. So now you've got the pluses and minuses of homogeneous and heterogeneous organizations. And you can imagine the difficulties in creating a strong social movement organization that's able to push for something as grand as and as aspirational as democracy. And this is why so many of these organizations and social movements tend to fizzle away. Look at Iran. We've had a handful of social movement organizations that have come up, and then they've fallen back down as the state used repression to increase the costs of action and increase the likelihood of being a free rider and watching out your apartment window as things go down. So I'm going to stop there.